Humanity did not arrive in the wider firmament with grace or prophecy. It arrived the way stone arrives at the bottom of a ravine, by falling long enough that the impact could not be ignored. The survey vessels that first crossed the boundary of Sol's heliopause did not sing an anthem or declare a destiny. They carried mining crews, environmental engineers, and people who had already learned that survival was a process rather than a promise. When the first non-human observers took note, they catalogued humanity as an emergent tool-using species with unusual tolerance for deprivation and an alarming tendency to rebuild after catastrophe. None of them predicted that those traits would matter on an interstellar scale. The world of Hekara lay under a yellow-white sun that flared unpredictably, bathing its third planet in radiation surges that would have stripped the atmosphere from a less stubborn sphere. Hekara itself endured through a dense magnetosphere and a crust rich with heavy metals that bled energy like a shield. The indigenous Sophonts had evolved beneath that sky with chitinous frames and distributed neural clusters, their societies structured around cycles of flare and calm. They valued anticipation and retreat, planning entire cities to fold inward when the sun screamed. To them, the idea of standing one's ground in the open during a stellar tantrum was not bravery but lunacy. The human settlement at Kestrel Reach sat on a basalt plain beyond the folded cities, anchored by pylons drilled deep into the crust. The first colonists had come under a lease agreement negotiated through translators and probabilistic trust engines. They were granted marginal land, judged unsuitable by Hekaran standards due to its exposure. The humans accepted without protest because marginal land was what they knew how to turn into something livable. They raised layered habitats, buried power lines, and coated their structures in ablative ceramics scavenged from decommissioned hulls. When the sun flared, they did not fold inward. They sealed, grounded, and waited. Rithkar of the 7th Planning Cohort observed Kestrel Reach through hardened lenses, her upper carapace angled to catch the shifting light. She had studied human behavior for 3 local cycles now, long enough to see patterns, but not long enough to be comfortable with them. The humans did not behave as a species that understood its own fragility. They overbuilt, overprepared, and then acted as if the resulting structures were merely adequate. They argued among themselves constantly, but when external pressure arrived, they aligned with unsettling speed. Today, pressure arrived in the form of an approaching flotilla that did not broadcast identity in any known protocol. The vessels were angular and dark, their drives emitting a signature that scraped at sensor arrays like grit. They decelerated at the edge of the system with confidence that suggested prior reconnaissance. Rithkar received the alert through the cohort's shared cognition and felt a ripple of concern propagate through her secondary nodes. Unknown arrivals were rare and never benign. The Planetary Defense Council convened in a chamber carved from bedrock, its walls threaded with energy conduits that hummed softly. Representatives from the major Hekaran polities folded their limbs into formal configurations. Human delegates arrived encased in pressure-rated suits, visors clear, posture relaxed in a way that set Rithkar's threat assessment nodes tingling. Among them was Mara Kincaid, the human coordinator for Kestrel Reach, a woman whose hair had gone prematurely gray from radiation exposure and stress. She had the habit of listening with her whole body, leaning forward slightly as if bracing against a wind only she could feel. The unknown flotilla altered course and split, half moving toward the inner system, half toward Hekara. Automated hails went unanswered. The Council's predictive models spun through scenarios, most of them unpleasant. The Hekaran inclination was to retreat, to fold cities and conserve resources while gathering more data. Humanity's inclination, as always, was less clear. Mara spoke when given the floor, her voice transmitted and translated without abbreviation or honorific. She outlined what little her people's senses had gathered and then made a proposal that caused a wave of agitation through the chamber. Kestrel Reach would remain operational and visible. Human defense platforms would power up, not to engage but to be seen. If the arrivals were hostile, early resistance might buy time. If they were not, transparency might avert escalation. Rithka studied the human as she spoke, noting the steady cadence and the tension in her jaw. This was not bravado. This was a calculation made by someone accustomed to being the thin layer between disaster and those who trusted her. The council deliberated, neural clusters flaring as probability trees branched and collapsed. In the end, the decision was fragmented. The Hekaran cities would fold inward as planned. The humans would do as they proposed, on their own authority. The separation of strategies was uneasy, but accepted. Rithka was tasked with remaining in observation, her cohort curious to see how humans would fare when the universe pushed back. The flotillas nearer half descended toward Kestrel Reach, with engines throttled to a controlled burn. As they approached, their hulls resolved into a configuration that made no concession to aesthetics, all function and threat. Human platforms tracked them, weapons charged but held. The distance closed until even unaided eyes could see the alien vessels hanging over the plain like dark thoughts. A transmission finally came, a burst of structured noise that translators struggled to parse. It resolved into a declaration of claim, asserting ownership over the system by right of prior traversal and superior force. The speakers named themselves with a cluster of sounds that did not map neatly to any human or Hekaran phonemes. They demanded immediate withdrawal of all lesser species. Mara listened to the translation in silence, then responded with a calm that belied the pounding of her heart. She rejected the claim, citing existing habitation and mutual agreements. She did not threaten, she did not beg. She stated facts and held the channel open. The response was immediate and violent. One of the alien vessels fired a kinetic lance that tore through a human defense platform, scattering debris across the plain. The humans did not scatter. They did not fold inward. Automated systems rerouted power, sealed breaches, and returned fire with precision bursts that scored but did not penetrate the alien hulls. The exchange was brief and devastating. 2 more human platforms were destroyed. One alien vessel lost maneuverability and drifted, venting atmosphere. Then the flotilla pulled back, engines flaring as they withdrew to a higher orbit. Rithka watched the aftermath with a mix of awe and dread. The humans had lost irreplaceable infrastructure, yet their response was not despair. Rescue teams deployed into irradiated zones without hesitation, retrieving survivors and salvage. Repairs began even as smoke still rose. The human settlement did not go dark. Lights flickered, then steadied. Power grids rebalanced. Life went on under a hostile sky. In the days that followed, the alien flotilla maintained a distant presence, probing with drones and feints. The humans adapted, learning the rhythms of the attacks and reinforcing weak points. They improvised shields from mining equipment and turned survey arrays into early warning systems. They shared data freely with the Hekaran, who integrated it into their own defenses despite their reluctance to engage. Rithka found herself reassessing long-held assumptions. The humans did not seek conflict, but neither did they yield ground once claimed. Their concept of territory was not just spatial, but invested with labor and loss. To abandon Kestrel Reach would be to abandon the effort poured into it, the scars earned making it habitable. That, to them, was unacceptable. The flotilla escalated. A coordinated strike targeted Kestrel Reach's power core, a buried complex that fed the settlement. The attack came during a stellar flare, when radiation levels were already high. Human defenses faltered under the combined assault. The power core was breached, and a plume of ionized material speared into the sky. For a moment, it seemed the settlement might finally fold, not by design, but by force. Mara was in the core when it happened, coordinating emergency shutdowns. She was thrown against a bulkhead, suit alarms screaming. She forced herself upright, ignoring pain, and issued orders that would reroute power from life support to containment. It was a choice that would kill some to save many. She made it without hesitation, because leadership had taught her that hesitation could be more lethal than error. Above ground, the settlement dimmed. Systems went offline. The alien flotilla surged forward, sensing weakness. Then something unexpected happened. The humans triggered a protocol that had never been shared with the Hecaran, not out of malice, but because it was untested. They vented sections of the settlement, releasing stored gases in controlled explosions that formed a transient debris field. It was crude and inefficient, but it confused alien targeting systems long enough for human weapons to find their mark. One alien vessel was destroyed outright. Another was crippled. The rest retreated again, this time to the edge of the system. The cost to Kestrel Reach was severe. Entire sectors were uninhabitable. Casualties were high. Yet when the dust settled, the settlement still stood, battered but unbroken. Rithka reported her observations to the 7th Planning Cohort with uncharacteristic emphasis. She described not just events but patterns, the way humans absorbed loss and converted it into resolve. She noted that their resilience was not infinite, but it was deeper than expected, rooted in a history of surviving on a world that had never been gentle. The cohort listened, neural clusters flickering with new models. The alien flotilla lingered for several more cycles, then withdrew entirely. Whether they had decided the system was not worth the cost or were merely regrouping was unclear. What was clear was that humanity had altered the calculus. They had demonstrated that even a so-called lesser species could impose a price high enough to matter. In the aftermath, Hecaran cities unfolded again, cautiously. Aid flowed to Kestrel Reach, materials and expertise offered without condition. Rithka visited the settlement in person, her carapace shielded against residual radiation. She walked among human structures patched and scarred, saw people at work amid ruins, laughing sometimes, arguing often, alive always. She met Mara again in a temporary command center, the walls still smelling of scorched metal. They spoke of the future, of defenses and diplomacy, of the likelihood that the alien flotilla would return or that others like them would come. There was no triumph in the conversation, only determination. As Rithka departed, she looked back at Kestrel Reach silhouetted against the restless sun. She understood then that humanity's defining trait was not aggression or ingenuity alone, but an unyielding relationship with the ground beneath their feet. Once they decided a place was worth the effort, they would endure radiation and ruin to keep it. The universe, vast and indifferent, would have to learn to account for that. The withdrawal of the alien flotilla did not bring peace so much as a different quality of tension, one that seeped into routines and dreams alike. At Kestrel Reach, recovery was not a ceremony, but an accumulation of actions taken under pressure. Structural teams worked in radiation-hardened suits, voices clipped and efficient over shared channels. Food synthesis schedules were recalculated daily as supply chains flexed around damaged infrastructure. The humans did not speak of victory because there was nothing victorious about counting the dead and sealing off corridors where bodies still lay unrecovered. Yet neither did they speak of defeat because the settlement still existed and existence was the metric that mattered. Mara Kincaid slept in short intervals when she slept at all. The breach in the power core replayed behind her eyes whenever she closed them, the moment of decision stretching and branching into 1,000 imagined alternatives. She reviewed after-action reports with the same relentless honesty she demanded of others, flagging errors without assigning blame. In the human cultural inheritance she carried, blame was a luxury reserved for times when survival was assured. Here, it was not. The Hecaran response unfolded more slowly, constrained by their own traditions and fears. Their cities had folded back into the open, but layers of shielding remained in place longer than necessary by human reckoning. Planning cohorts convened repeatedly, their distributed minds adjusting models that had been stable for generations. Rithka found herself called upon more frequently. Her direct observations of human behavior now weighted more heavily than abstract projections. She experienced an unfamiliar sensation akin to pride, though she would not have named it as such, when her assessments shaped policy. One outcome of those deliberations was the establishment of a joint monitoring station in high orbit, crewed by both species. The Hecaran saw it as a compromise between engagement and retreat, a way to gather data without committing ground assets. The humans saw it as another line of early warning and agreed readily, contributing materials and personnel despite their own strained resources. Construction began within a local cycle, modules assembled from a patchwork of design philosophies that did not always align but held together through sheer redundancy. Among the human contingent assigned to the station was Jonah Reyes, a systems integrator whose previous work involved stabilizing aging habitats on the fringes of Sol. He had learned to distrust elegant solutions, preferring those that could be repaired with limited tools and imperfect information. The station suited him, its systems layered and inelegant, full of manual overrides that would horrify a purist. He found common ground with his Hecaran counterparts in that shared suspicion of fragility, though their reasons differed. As the station came online, long-range sensors began to pick up anomalies beyond the edge of the system. They were faint at first, statistical whispers against the background noise of space, but persistent. The patterns suggested not a single fleet, but multiple independent vectors, converging not on Hecara itself, but on regions nearby. The implication was unsettling. The alien flotilla that had attacked Kestrel Reach might not have been an isolated aggressor, but a symptom of something larger, a migratory pressure moving through this spiral arm. When the data was presented to the Planetary Defense Council, the chamber hummed with restrained agitation. The Hecaran instinct to withdraw resurfaced, strengthened by the prospect of multiple threats. Some cohorts argued for sealing the system entirely, abandoning outlying settlements and conserving resources. Others pointed to the humans as evidence that engagement could alter outcomes. The debate did not resolve cleanly, but it shifted. For the first time, withdrawal was weighed against the cost of abandoning allies who had demonstrated a willingness to stand. Mara listened to the proceedings via delayed transmission, her attention divided between the Council's words and the status feeds scrolling across her display. When she spoke, she did not appeal to shared values or abstract futures. She spoke of logistics. She outlined how Kestrel Reach had become a testbed for rapid adaptation, how its defenses and failures had generated data that now benefited the entire planet. She argued that presence itself was a form of censor, that an empty system learned nothing. Her tone was measured, but beneath it lay the same unyielding conviction that had kept her upright in the power core. The Council authorized expanded cooperation, cautious and conditional. Human engineers were granted access to certain Hecaran manufacturing techniques, while Hecaran analysts embedded with human defense teams. It was not an alliance forged in warmth, but in mutual recognition of necessity. Rithka was assigned as liaison, her role formalized beyond observation. She accepted with a sense of gravity, aware that this step would change her relationship with both societies. On the ground, Kestrel Reach became a crucible for those changes. Hecaran specialists arrived in numbers small enough to manage, but large enough to matter, their presence drawing curious glances from human residents who had previously known them only as distant silhouettes behind shields. Differences in physiology and communication created friction. Hecaran sensitivity to radiation made certain areas off-limits, while human informality grated against Hecaran protocols. Yet work progressed, because work had to. One project in particular drew intense focus, the reinforcement of the settlement's subsurface anchor network. Human miners had drilled deep into the basalt during initial construction, but the recent attacks revealed weaknesses in how shock propagated through the crust. Hecaran geophysicists, whose species had evolved alongside a volatile sun, brought models that treated planetary crust as a living system rather than inert matter. Together, they devised a lattice of counter-resonance structures that could dissipate energy more effectively. It was an inelegant hybrid, heavy and resource-intensive, but it promised to make Kestrel Reach harder to crack. As construction progressed, rumors circulated through human channels, fragments of intercepted transmissions, and speculative analysis. Some spoke of the alien aggressors as scavengers driven by resource depletion elsewhere. Others suggested a hierarchical society testing defenses before committing larger forces. Without clear answers, anxiety simmered. Families debated evacuation plans even as they signed up for additional shifts. The paradox of human behavior manifested again. The same people who argued loudly about risk stayed when departure would have been safer. Rithka observed these dynamics with growing fascination. Her species valued foresight and avoidance, having learned that survival under an unstable sun required minimizing exposure. Humans seem to invert that lesson, exposing themselves deliberately to risk in order to reshape it. Their history, as she studied it, was a catalogue of environments made marginal by chance or folly and then rendered livable through persistence. The pattern repeated here on a scale that made her neural clusters ache. The Joint Monitoring Station detected the first clear sign of the converging anomalies when a probe returned fragmented data before going dark. The fragments showed vessels unlike the earlier flotilla, their signatures distinct but sharing a commonality in drive physics that suggested a shared origin or technology exchange. The probe's last readings indicated course corrections toward Hecara's outer system. The timeline was uncertain, but the direction was clear. Emergency sessions followed, decisions stacking atop one another faster than tradition would have allowed a cycle earlier. Evacuation plans were drafted and revised. Defense platforms were upgraded with what materials could be spared. The humans proposed an outward expansion of sensor nets, pushing presence farther into the system despite the risk. Some Hecaran cohorts objected, citing provocation. Others countered that ignorance was a greater provocation still. The proposal passed by a narrow margin. Mara authorized the deployment from Kestrel Reach, knowing that each new outpost would stretch their already thin resources. She justified it to herself with the same calculus she had used in the power core. Better to choose where to bleed than to wait for the wound. Jonah Reyes found himself overseeing the integration of human and Hecaran systems in the new sensor arrays, his days consumed by troubleshooting mismatched interfaces and his nights by dreams of alarms that never stopped. The first contact with the new arrivals did not take the form of an attack. Instead, a transmission arrived, broad spectrum and repeated, its structure complex and layered. Translators struggled, parsing intent from unfamiliar grammar. The message, once partially decoded, conveyed a warning rather than a demand. It spoke of territory under pressure, of migratory waves driven by forces further out, of competition that had culled the weak. It did not ask permission to pass through. It stated that passage would occur. The warning reframed the conflict. The earlier attack on Kestrel Reach now appeared as a probe by a desperate or opportunistic group, rather than a vanguard of conquest. The new arrivals were something else, larger in scale and less interested in negotiation. They were not claiming ownership so much as announcing inevitability. The Council's response was fractured but decisive. Full withdrawal was considered and rejected, not because it was impossible, but because it would not solve the problem. Passage through the system would still expose Hecara to risk, and an empty system would invite occupation later. The humans argued that presence could shape the terms of passage, even if it could not prevent it. They proposed a corridor, a managed transit path that would minimize interaction with inhabited regions. It was a bold idea, bordering on naive, but it offered an alternative to helplessness. Negotiations began through the imperfect translation channels, tense and halting. The new arrivals responded with skepticism, but not hostility. They assessed Hekara and Kestrel Reach with cold efficiency, noting defenses and population centers. They questioned the humans' claim to stake ground in a system, not their origin. Mara replied without defensiveness, outlining the work invested, the lives built, the agreements made. She did not argue ownership in abstract terms, but in accumulated effort. Rithka watched the exchange with her distributed mind, engaged at full capacity. She recognized that humanity was doing something her species rarely attempted, reframing inevitability as a variable. They could not stop a migratory wave driven by distant pressures, but they could influence its shape. The question was whether influence would be enough. As talks continued, the pressure within Kestrel Reach mounted. Defense drills ran daily. Children were moved to deeper shelters, their routines disrupted but maintained as much as possible. The human tendency to normalize danger manifested again, a coping mechanism refined over centuries of living on a world that could kill without intent. Hekaran visitors found it unsettling, mistaking calm for denial until they saw the underlying readiness. The migratory vessels entered the outer system weeks later, their sheer number dwarfing previous encounters. They moved along trajectories that brushed the edges of the proposed corridor, testing responses. Human and Hekaran defenses tracked, but did not engage. Each non-engagement was a choice, deliberate and fraught. When a vessel strayed too close to a sensor array, human platforms illuminated it with targeting lasers, a silent warning. The vessel adjusted course, marginally. Small successes accumulated, invisible to those who expected dramatic turns. The corridor held, more by mutual calculation than goodwill. The cost was constant vigilance and the acceptance that any misstep could escalate. Through it all, Kestrel Reach remained a focal point, its battered structures a testament to what resistance could achieve even when it did not win outright. In quieter moments, Mara stood at an observation window and watched the restless sun flare and subside. She thought of Earth, of storms and tectonic shifts, and the long human habit of building anyway. She knew that the future here would not be secure or simple, but she also knew that humanity had never waited for the universe to become gentle before making a home. Rithka, observing from the joint station, reached a conclusion she shared with her cohort. Humanity was not a shield that could block all harm, nor a spear that could drive threats away. It was something more unsettling to the universe's indifferent logic, a weight. Once placed, it altered trajectories, bent paths, and forced even vast movements to account for it. The migratory wave passing through Hekara would not be stopped, but it would remember the resistance it encountered, the ground that refused to yield easily. The system endured the passage, scarred but intact. Kestrel Reach bore new damage, but it also bore new reinforcements and deeper connections between species that had once kept polite distance. As the last of the migratory vessels slipped beyond the system's edge, there was no celebration, only a collective exhale and a return to work. Humanity had not conquered space or proven supremacy. It had done what it always did when faced with overwhelming forces. It had stood, adapted, and remained, reshaping the future not through grand declarations, but through the stubborn refusal to disappear. The passage of the migratory wave left behind a system that looked unchanged at a distance, but felt altered in ways that defied easy measurement. Orbital paths had been subtly perturbed by mass and drive wake, debris fields had shifted, and radiation belts carried new noise patterns that confounded older models. More importantly, assumptions had been broken. The belief that isolation or retreat could guarantee safety no longer held. The universe had demonstrated that motion elsewhere could impose consequence here, regardless of intent. For Hekara and for the humans of Kestrel Reach, the question was no longer whether contact would occur, but how often and under what terms? Recovery entered a new phase, one less frantic than the immediate aftermath of attack, yet more demanding in its scope. Repairs became upgrades by necessity. Every damaged system was an opportunity to reinforce, to integrate lessons learned under fire. The human approach favored iteration, replacing broken components with slightly better ones, layering redundancy until failure became noisy and slow rather than sudden. Hekaran engineers, initially skeptical of such apparent inefficiency, began to appreciate how it aligned with their own evolutionary history of surviving a capricious star. Systems that failed gradually could be managed. Systems that failed cleanly were death traps. Mara Kincaid oversaw this transformation with a blend of exhaustion and grim satisfaction. She had lost count of how many times she had signed off on reallocations that would have been unthinkable months earlier. Kestrel Reach was no longer merely a settlement. It was an anchor point for a philosophy of presence. Supplies arrived not just from Earth-aligned networks, but from Hekaran manufactories, their designs adapted to human tolerances. In return, humans shared field-modified schematics and operational doctrines born from hard experience. The exchange was not symmetrical, but it was sincere. Rithka's role evolved alongside these changes. No longer just a liaison, she became a translator in the deeper sense, interpreting not only language, but intent and habit. She found herself mediating disputes that arose from mismatched expectations, such as when a Hekaran safety committee objected to human volunteers entering a partially stabilized reactor zone. To the committee, the risk was unacceptable. To the humans, the risk was bounded and therefore manageable. Rithka learned to frame these arguments in terms each side could grasp, translating human tolerance for danger into Hekaran concepts of calculated exposure. The Joint Monitoring Station expanded its mandate, its sensors now tasked with mapping not just immediate threats, but broader patterns of movement through the region. Jonah Reyes spent long shifts correlating data streams, his eyes gritty from recycled air and too much caffeine. He noticed something subtle but persistent. The migratory wave had not been uniform. Some vessels deviated more than others, lingering near defended systems before moving on. It suggested curiosity or perhaps assessment, a kind of ecological probing. He flagged the pattern and sent it up the chain, unsure whether it would matter. It mattered sooner than he expected. Weeks after the last migratory vessel departed, a small group returned, distinct from both the earlier attackers and the main wave. Their approach was cautious, their drives throttled back to minimize signature. They broadcast a narrowband signal that resolved quickly into a request rather than a warning. They sought access to materials and data in exchange for information about conditions further along the migratory path. They framed the exchange as mutually beneficial, a way to avoid future conflict. The Council reconvened under conditions that would have seemed absurd not long ago. Representatives debated whether engaging in trade with transient groups would invite exploitation or create leverage. The Hekaran inclination leaned toward refusal, citing the risk of normalizing intrusion. The humans, informed by a long history of frontier trade and uneasy coexistence, saw opportunity. Information, they argued, was a resource as critical as any metal or fuel. Knowing what lay ahead could shape defenses more effectively than isolation. Mara advocated for a controlled engagement, limited in scope and monitored closely. She acknowledged the risks without minimizing them. Her argument hinged on agency. If others would pass through regardless, then shaping the terms of passage was preferable to being shaped by them. The Council approved a trial exchange, narrowly circumscribed and contingent on transparency. Rithka was assigned to observe, her insights deemed essential to interpreting non-human negotiation styles. The meeting took place in high orbit, aboard a platform modified to accommodate varied physiologies. The visiting group's representatives were unlike any species previously encountered by either humans or Hecaran. Their forms were elongated and flexible, supported by internal structures that shifted subtly as they moved. Their sensory apparatus suggested a reliance on fields and gradients rather than discrete organs. Communication flowed through layered signals that translators rendered imperfectly but adequately. The exchange was tense but orderly. The visitors provided data on regions beyond Hekara, including the source of the migratory pressure, a cluster of systems destabilized by a cascading failure of stellar containment technologies used by an advanced civilization now in decline. The failure had rendered multiple worlds uninhabitable, driving populations outward in waves that competed for remaining resources. The visitors framed themselves as scouts and intermediaries, seeking to navigate this chaos without being crushed by it. In return, the Council offered limited access to non-critical materials and anonymized sensor data. The humans insisted on safeguards that would prevent the visitors from mapping inhabited areas in detail. The Hecaran added constraints rooted in their own security doctrines. The visitors accepted, their internal structures rippling in a manner translators suggested was agreement tinged with impatience. Afterward, debate flared anew. Some saw the exchange as a dangerous precedent. Others viewed it as the first step toward a network of shared information that could mitigate the worst effects of the migratory waves. Rithka reported her impressions to the 7th Planning Cohort, noting that the visitors' caution mirrored their desperation. They were not conquerors, but survivors navigating a collapsing environment. The distinction mattered, though it did not eliminate risk. As information flowed in from the exchange, a clearer picture of the region emerged. Hekara lay on the edge of a turbulent zone, likely to experience intermittent traffic for cycles to come. Permanent occupation by external groups was possible but not inevitable. Systems that demonstrated resilience and coordination were more likely to be bypassed or negotiated with than overrun. The data reinforced what the humans had intuited through experience. Being visibly prepared altered behavior. This understanding drove a new phase of construction at Kestrel Reach. The settlement expanded outward, not in population, but in infrastructure, creating decoy installations and layered defenses that extended its apparent footprint. The goal was not to deceive, but to signal investment. A place that had required effort to build and maintain was a place that would extract a cost if challenged. It was an argument made in metal and energy rather than words. Human residents adapted to the prolonged state of readiness in ways that surprised even themselves. Community rituals emerged, informal and unplanned, centered on maintenance days and shared meals in reinforced halls. Children grew up with emergency drills as background rhythm, their play incorporating imaginary repairs and negotiations with unseen visitors. It was not a childhood free of fear, but it was one that normalized responsibility. Hecaran observers, initially alarmed by this casual integration of danger into daily life, began to see parallels with their own histories. Their ancestors had taught younglings to read solar patterns and respond instinctively to flares. Humans taught theirs to read alarms and understand containment procedures. Different hazards, similar adaptations. Rithka documented these observations, her reports increasingly reflective, less detached than protocol would have preferred. The calm did not last. A new incursion arrived without warning, not a migratory group, but a concentrated force bearing the same signatures as the original attackers. They emerged from a vector masked by residual distortions left by the earlier wave, exploiting gaps in sensor coverage. Their intent was unmistakable. They targeted not Kestrel Reach directly, but a Hecaran resource hub in a nearby orbit, perhaps assuming it to be softer prey. The response was swift and coordinated in a way that would have been impossible months earlier. Human platforms and Hecaran defenses shared targeting data in real time, their systems now partially interoperable. The attackers met resistance immediately, losing one vessel before they could even assess the defenses arrayed against them. They pressed the attack regardless, driven by motives that defied rational cost-benefit analysis. Mara found herself back in a command role she had hoped to avoid so soon. She issued orders with practiced calm, delegating authority to teams she trusted. The lessons of the power core breach informed every decision. No single system was allowed to become a point of failure. When a human platform took heavy damage, Hecaran drones moved to reinforce it without waiting for formal request. The line between allies blurred under fire. The battle was brief but intense. The attackers, outmatched and surprised by the depth of coordination, attempted to withdraw. Human interceptors harried them just enough to discourage immediate return, careful not to overextend. When the last hostile vessel fled, the system was left shaken but intact. The resource hubs suffered damage but remained operational. Casualties were lower than feared, a testament to preparation rather than luck. In the aftermath, there was no question of whether cooperation would continue. The shared defense had validated months of uncomfortable integration. The Council formalized agreements that had previously been provisional, codifying protocols for joint response. It was not a declaration of unity, but it was recognition of interdependence. Rithka's cohort adjusted its long-term projections accordingly, their models now including humanity as a stabilizing variable rather than a wildcard. Jonah Reyes reviewed the battle data with a mix of relief and lingering unease. The attackers' persistence suggested they were under pressures not alleviated by a single defeat. Somewhere beyond the mapped region, conditions continued to deteriorate, driving cycles of aggression that no amount of local defense could fully prevent. He shared his concerns upward, aware that solutions would require thinking beyond any single system. Mara, for her part, took little comfort in survival alone. She knew that each successful defense raised the stakes, painting Kestrel Reach and Hekara as obstacles rather than easy targets. Yet she also saw the alternative. Yielding ground would not remove the pressure, it would merely shift it onto those less prepared. Humanity's history weighed on her, a record of hard choices made under worse skies. She drew strength from it without romanticizing the cost. Rithka visited Kestrel Reach again after the battle, walking through corridors that still bore fresh scars. She observed humans and Hecaran working side by side, their differences rendered secondary by shared tasks. In a quiet moment, she reflected on how her species had once believed survival lay in anticipation and withdrawal. That belief had served them well under a violent sun. Now, under a crowded galaxy, a new lesson was emerging. Sometimes survival required presence, a willingness to be seen and to push back, not out of aggression, but out of commitment to what had been built. As cycles turned, the system settled into a precarious equilibrium. Threats did not vanish, but they became manageable, shaped by the knowledge that Hekara was not undefended and not isolated. Kestrel Reach stood as a visible marker of that truth, its structures layered and scarred, its people unbowed. Humanity had not claimed dominion over the stars. It had claimed responsibility for the ground it stood on, and in doing so, had begun to alter the currents of a region in flux. The universe continued to move, indifferent and vast. Yet within that movement, small masses could exert influence if they held together. The humans and Hecaran of this system were learning, together, what it meant to be such a mass, to resist not by overwhelming force, but by unyielding continuity. The future remained uncertain, but uncertainty was no longer synonymous with helplessness. Stability, when it came, was never a stillness. It was a pattern of motion that did not immediately tear itself apart. For the Hecaran system, the months following the second incursion settled into such a pattern, a rhythm of vigilance, adaptation, and incremental trust. Traffic continued at the fringes, transient groups skirting the corridor, or requesting limited access under newly standardized protocols. Some were turned away, others passed through under escort. Each interaction refined the shared understanding of what presence meant in a crowded region of space. Kestrel Reach became both symbol and laboratory. Its continued existence under pressure attracted attention from beyond the immediate migratory flows. Independent traders, information brokers, and displaced research enclaves began to test the system's boundaries, drawn by the reputation of a place that did not fold at the first sign of danger. Not all were welcome. The Council enforced its rules with a firmness that surprised those accustomed to exploiting fragmented defenses. The message was consistent. Passage was possible, predation was not. For humanity, this shift marked a subtle but profound change. For the first time since leaving their origin system in significant numbers, humans were not merely guests or junior partners in an older interstellar order. They were co-architects of a regional equilibrium. This did not translate into prestige or ease. It translated into responsibility, the kind that demanded constant attention and accepted no final victory. Mara Kincaid felt the weight of that responsibility keenly. Her role expanded beyond Kestrel Reach into broader strategic coordination, a transition she had neither sought nor resisted. She understood that leadership in such a context was less about authority than about endurance. Decisions had to be made with incomplete information and lived with afterward. She cultivated a habit of walking the settlement during off hours, speaking with maintenance crews, medics, and educators. Their concerns grounded her, reminding her that abstract strategy ultimately served individual lives. One such walk brought her to the outer fabrication yards, where a new class of modular defense platforms was taking shape. These platforms embodied lessons learned across multiple engagements, distributed control, layered shielding, and the ability to be partially dismantled and rebuilt in situ. They were not sleek. They were heavy, angular, and unapologetically functional. Human engineers joked that they looked like stubborn arguments made of metal. The humor masked pride, the quiet satisfaction of tools built to last. Hecaran oversight teams monitored construction with professional interest. Their initial discomfort with human improvisation had given way to respect for its results. They contributed refinements where their experience with radiation and stellar volatility offered advantages. The resulting designs bore little resemblance to anything either species would have produced alone. They were artifacts of convergence, practical proof that cooperation could generate resilience greater than the sum of its parts. Rithka observed these developments with a mind attuned to long arcs. She spent time both on the ground and in orbit, her perceptions bridging scales that individual humans could not easily hold. She noted how quickly shared routines formed, how joint teams developed their own shorthand and expectations. Conflict still arose, but it resolved more often through adjustment than withdrawal. To Rithka, this represented a cultural shift as significant as any technological advance. The 7th Planning Cohort, reviewing her reports, began to reconsider foundational doctrines. For generations, Hecaran survival strategy had centered on minimizing exposure, conserving resources, and avoiding entanglements. That approach had been rational under a hostile sun and a relatively empty space. Now space was no longer empty, and avoidance alone could not guarantee survival. The cohort did not abandon caution, but it began to integrate a new variable, influence through sustained presence. This recalibration extended beyond defense. Trade frameworks were revised to allow deeper integration with human logistics networks. Educational exchanges expanded, with Hecaran analysts studying human crisis management methodologies and humans learning Hecaran long-term planning techniques. The exchange was not without friction. Humans found some Hecaran processes glacially slow. Hecaran found human decision-making alarmingly informal. Yet over time, a hybrid tempo emerged, balancing urgency with deliberation. Jonah Reyes found himself unexpectedly drawn into this cultural synthesis. His work on the monitoring station expanded to include training sessions for mixed-species crews. He developed teaching materials that emphasized principles over procedures, knowing that rigid steps would fail under unfamiliar conditions. His background in maintaining aging systems proved valuable, as did his instinct for spotting failure modes before they cascaded. He took quiet pride in watching Hekaran technicians adapt these lessons, translating them into their own operational language. The broader region, however, did not grant the luxury of complacency. Data from the information exchange revealed that the source of the migratory pressure was evolving. The initial cascade failure had given way to secondary collapses, destabilizing systems thought to be marginally secure. Each collapse sent new waves of displaced populations outward, some organized, others fragmented and desperate. The probability models suggested that such waves would continue for many cycles, with unpredictable vectors. This reality forced the Council to confront a question it had previously deferred. What role, if any, would Hekara and its human allies play beyond their own system? Could they remain a defended island amid turbulence, or would their choices inevitably affect neighbors they had not yet met? The question was not framed in moral terms, though morality hovered at its edges. It was framed in strategic ones. Influence radiated outward, whether acknowledged or not. Mara argued that pretending otherwise would be dangerous. She proposed limited outreach, sharing non-sensitive data with adjacent systems willing to reciprocate. The goal was not to form an alliance network overnight, but to seed awareness, reducing the likelihood of blind collisions between groups under stress. Some council members worried this would entangle them in conflicts beyond their capacity. Others saw it as an extension of the same logic that had justified the corridor. Visibility reduced risk. The proposal passed with amendments. Outreach would be cautious, revocable, and mediated through the joint station. Humanity's role as a species accustomed to wide, messy networks made them natural intermediaries. Hekaran analysts would retain oversight, ensuring that engagement did not outpace capacity. It was another compromise, imperfect but actionable. The first outreach effort yielded mixed results. One neighboring system responded with guarded interest, sharing partial data and expressing relief at not being alone in their observations. Another rejected contact outright, citing internal instability. A third did not respond at all, its silence ominous. Each outcome informed future attempts, reinforcing the lesson that influence could not be imposed uniformly. Amid these developments, an internal crisis tested the resilience of Kestrel Reach in an unexpected way. A failure in one of the older habitat rings, weakened by cumulative radiation damage, led to a slow atmospheric leak. The alarms were subtle, easily mistaken for sensor noise amid constant background fluctuations. It was a Hekaran technician who noticed the anomaly, her sensitivity to pressure gradients attuned to such deviations. Her alert triggered a response that prevented catastrophic decompression, but not before several sections had to be evacuated. The incident shook confidence. It was a reminder that danger did not always announce itself with hostile fleets. Wear and entropy were adversaries as relentless as any external threat. The evacuation displaced dozens of families, straining already limited living space. Tempers flared. Accusations surfaced, some aimed at human maintenance crews for pushing systems beyond their intended lifespan, others at Hekaran inspectors for not insisting on earlier shutdowns. Mara convened an open forum rather than allowing resentment to fester. She laid out the facts plainly, acknowledging errors without scapegoating. She emphasized that the incident was a shared failure and a shared responsibility. Repair plans were presented alongside relocation support, and volunteers stepped forward to assist those affected. The forum did not erase anger, but it channeled it into action. Repairs began within hours, incorporating additional redundancies and inspection protocols. Rithka observed the forum with particular interest. In Hecaran society, such grievances would have been processed through formal channels, often slowly and abstractly. The human approach was messier, emotionally charged, but immediate. It reduced the time between recognition of harm and corrective action. Rithka noted that this immediacy carried risks of its own, but also a capacity for rapid recalibration that her species lacked. As the habitat ring was stabilized and gradually reoccupied, trust deepened in small, tangible ways. The Hecaran technician who had raised the alarm was publicly acknowledged, her contributions celebrated without ceremony but with genuine appreciation. Such recognition resonated across cultural lines, reinforcing the value of attentiveness regardless of origin. Beyond the system, pressures mounted. A report arrived detailing a violent confrontation between two migratory groups in a neighboring region, resulting in significant loss of life and destabilization of local space. The incident underscored the fragility of the broader environment and the potential for conflict to escalate rapidly when desperation met desperation. The Council faced renewed debate about intervention versus insulation. This time, the discussion unfolded differently. Experience had shifted perspectives. Withdrawal was no longer seen as a neutral act, but as a choice with consequences. Engagement, though risky, offered opportunities to shape outcomes. The Council authorized a limited observational mission to the affected region, staffed by volunteers from both species. Its mandate was narrow: gather data, offer mediation if feasible, and withdraw if conditions deteriorated. Jonah Reyes was among those selected, his expertise in unstable systems deemed valuable. He accepted with a mix of apprehension and resolve, aware that this mission extended the pattern that had brought humanity to Kestrel Reach in the first place. Rithka was assigned as senior observer, her presence lending both analytical depth and symbolic weight. As the mission vessel departed, Mara watched from the command center, tracking its trajectory until it slipped beyond immediate sensor range. She felt the familiar tension of sending people into uncertainty, a tension she had learned to carry without letting it paralyze her. She knew that the measure of their efforts would not be in avoiding all harm, but in whether they continued to act with intention rather than reaction. The system continued its vigilance in their absence, routines holding. Kestrel Reach endured, its people repairing, teaching, arguing, and planning under a restless sun. The Hecaran cities maintained their balance between openness and retreat. The joint station watched the dark between stars, its sensors patient and alert. What emerged from these months was not a new order imposed from above, but a habit of persistence shared across species. Humanity did not transform the region through conquest or ideology. It did so by remaining present, by accepting the cost of engagement, and by refusing to abandon what it had built when the universe pressed in. That refusal, echoed and amplified by allies who saw its value, began to ripple outward, subtle but consequential. The ground beneath Kestrel Reach remained unyielding not because it could not be broken, but because those who stood upon it were prepared to rebuild it again and again. In a galaxy reshaped by movement and collapse, that willingness became a force in its own right, shaping paths not through dominance, but through the simple, stubborn fact of continued existence. The mission vessel crossed the boundary of familiar space with no fanfare, its hull bearing the layered scars of prior engagements and refits. It was not a symbol meant to impress, nor a spear meant to threaten. It was a tool built to endure uncertainty, carrying with it a small crew tasked with observing chaos without becoming part of it. Jonah Reyes felt the transition keenly, the subtle shift in background radiation and sensor noise marking their passage from a region shaped by months of vigilance into one still actively tearing itself apart. Rithka occupied a containment-adapted chamber near the vessel's core, her sensory arrays interfaced with external feeds. She experienced space less as emptiness and more as a tapestry of gradients and disturbances, each deviation a potential signal. Even so, the region they approached overwhelmed her models. Wreckage drifted in irregular clouds, remnants of habitats and vessels broken open and abandoned. Drive signatures overlapped in confusing layers, evidence of multiple groups passing through, colliding and fleeing. The aftermath of conflict was not orderly. It was noisy, persistent, and unresolved. The crew moved with quiet efficiency, their training emphasizing restraint. Weapons systems remained powered but cold, their presence intended as insurance rather than invitation. Jonah monitored structural integrity and power flow, aware that any failure here would be harder to repair than back home. He found his thoughts drifting to Kestrel Reach, to the steady routines that now defined life there. The contrast sharpened his focus. This mission mattered precisely because stability elsewhere was fragile. They identified the contested zone quickly. Two clusters of vessels occupied overlapping volumes of space, maneuvering cautiously around one another amid debris. Neither side appeared dominant. Their movements suggested exhaustion as much as hostility, drives flaring briefly before cutting off to conserve fuel. Intermittent weapons fire flared and vanished, more warning than assault. It was a standoff sustained by mutual fear of overcommitment. The mission vessel broadcast its presence on a wide spectrum, announcing intent to observe and, if acceptable, to facilitate communication. The signal was repeated at intervals, adjusted for likely perceptual differences. For long minutes, there was no response. Jonah felt the familiar tightening in his chest, the awareness that silence here could precede disaster. He resisted the urge to reroute power or adjust course unnecessarily, trusting the protocols they had refined through hard experience. A response finally came, fragmented and raw. Translators struggled, piecing together intent from incomplete data. One group acknowledged the broadcast and issued a warning to keep distance. The other responded with suspicion, accusing the first of manipulation and theft. Both claimed prior rights to the region, rights that predated the cascading failures that had driven them here. Neither seemed willing to yield, yet both were clearly constrained by dwindling resources. Rithka processed the exchange with careful detachment. She recognized patterns of desperation that transcended species. Each group framed its claims not as aggression, but as survival, a justification that made compromise psychologically difficult. She relayed her assessment to Jonah and the mission commander, emphasizing that escalation would likely come from misinterpretation rather than intent. The recommendation was simple in concept and complex in execution: slow the interaction down. The vessel adjusted position, placing itself equidistant from both clusters, a visible but non-threatening presence. It broadcast again, this time offering to relay messages neutrally and to share limited environmental data that could clarify the situation. The offer was deliberately modest. Anything more ambitious risked rejection. Minutes stretched. Then one group accepted the relay, followed reluctantly by the other. A channel opened, imperfect but functional. What followed was less negotiation than mutual accusation. Each side recounted losses, betrayals, and near misses, their narratives overlapping but never aligning. Jonah listened, struck by how familiar the tone was. He had heard similar arguments during resource disputes back home, scaled up now to existential stakes. The difference lay in the absence of shared institutions to absorb tension. Here, every disagreement threatened to turn lethal. Rithka intervened at carefully chosen moments, reframing statements to strip away implied hostility without altering substance. She emphasized common constraints, pointing out how environmental instability limited options for both groups. She highlighted data showing that continued conflict would degrade the region further, making it less viable for anyone. Her approach drew on Hekaran traditions of consensus building, adapted to a context far messier than her species had ever faced. progress was incremental and fragile. One group admitted to damaging a resource platform belonging to the other, justifying the act as preemptive defense. The other acknowledged retaliatory strikes that had gone further than intended. Neither offered apology, but both expressed exhaustion. That shared fatigue became an opening. The mission vessel proposed a temporary separation of space, a cooling period during which neither side would approach certain coordinates. In exchange, the vessel would share updated sensor data to reduce the risk of accidental encounters. Agreement came slowly, hedged with conditions and caveats, yet it came. The standoff eased, vessels altering course with visible reluctance. Weapons fire ceased. It was not peace, but it was a pause. Jonah exhaled without realizing he had been holding his breath. He knew the arrangement could collapse at any moment, but even a pause had value in an environment where momentum favored destruction. Data collected during the pause painted a grim picture. Both groups were fragments of larger populations scattered by the initial collapse, their original social structures eroded by loss and constant movement. They lacked reliable information about conditions elsewhere, making every decision a gamble. The mission vessel's limited data sharing had outsized impact, reducing uncertainty just enough to make restraint possible. The mission did not linger longer than necessary. After confirming that the separation held, the vessel withdrew to a safer distance, maintaining passive observation. Jonah spent hours compiling reports, documenting not just technical findings, but behavioral insights. He emphasized how quickly interactions escalated in the absence of shared frameworks, and how even minimal mediation could alter trajectories. The report was dense and unsentimental, reflecting his belief that clarity mattered more than comfort. Rithkas supplemented the report with her own analysis, framing the encounter within broader regional dynamics. She argued that the pressures driving conflict were structural, not moral. Without intervention, similar clashes would proliferate, destabilizing entire corridors of space. She cautioned against overconfidence, noting that mediation required sustained effort and credibility. A single successful pause did not guarantee future cooperation. The return journey was quiet. The crew carried the weight of what they had seen, each processing it differently. Jonah found himself thinking about the children at Kestrel Reach, growing up with drills and shared meals, their lives structured around preparedness rather than panic. He contrasted that with the fractured groups they had just encountered, whose young would inherit only movement and loss. The thought hardened his resolve. Stability, however precarious, was worth defending and extending. When the vessel re-entered the Hekaran system, it was greeted not with ceremony, but with immediate integration into ongoing operations. The data they carried fed directly into updated models and protocols. The Council convened to review the findings, its members more somber than before. The mission had confirmed what many feared. The region's instability was not a passing phase, but a prolonged condition. Debate followed, intense and sustained. Some argued that the system's resources should be conserved, that outreach risked entanglement beyond capacity. Others countered that disengagement would not insulate them from cascading failures. The evidence from the mission weighed heavily. Mediation had worked, briefly and imperfectly, but it had worked. That fact could not be ignored. Mara spoke after listening longer than usual. She acknowledged the risks without minimizing them. She spoke of Kestrel Reach, of how its survival had depended on refusing to treat isolation as safety. She drew a parallel between maintaining a settlement under hostile skies and maintaining a region under migratory pressure. Both required presence, repair, and the willingness to engage with uncertainty. Her words did not promise resolution. They offered a direction. The Council authorized the establishment of a small mediation cadre, drawn from both species, tasked with monitoring flashpoints and offering intervention where feasible. It was a limited mandate, carefully bounded. The goal was not to police the region, but to provide a stabilizing influence where possible, informed by the understanding that inaction was also a choice with consequences. Resources were allocated reluctantly but decisively. Rithka was appointed to lead the Cadre's analytical branch, her experience uniquely suited to the role. Jonah Reyes was offered a position as a technical advisor, his first-hand knowledge invaluable. He accepted after brief consideration, aware that the role would pull him further from the relative safety of Kestrel Reach. The decision felt less like a sacrifice than an extension of a path already chosen. Life at Kestrel Reach adapted again to this expanded horizon. Training programs incorporated mediation scenarios alongside defense drills. Communication systems were upgraded to handle a wider range of protocols. The settlement's identity shifted subtly from outpost under siege to node within a fragile network. This did not reduce the sense of danger, but it contextualized it. Threats were no longer isolated events, but part of a larger pattern they were learning to navigate. Hecaran society grappled with its own transformation. The notion that survival might depend on shaping external dynamics rather than retreating from them challenged deeply held assumptions. Yet evidence mounted that presence conferred leverage, however limited. The 7th Planning Cohort revised long-term projections, factoring in the stabilizing effect of cooperative nodes like Kestrel Reach. The revisions did not eliminate risk, but they suggested pathways that avoided catastrophic collapse. The first deployment of the mediation cadre occurred sooner than expected. A minor dispute along the corridor threatened to escalate, triggered by a misinterpreted sensor maneuver. The cadre intervened quickly, leveraging established channels and shared data to clarify intent. The incident resolved without violence. It was a small success, easily overlooked, but to those involved it felt significant. Prevention, unlike defense, left no wreckage to testify to its value. Mara observed these developments with cautious optimism. She knew that systems built on constant vigilance were prone to fatigue. She invested time in supporting the people who sustained that vigilance, ensuring rotations, counseling, and moments of rest. She understood that endurance was not infinite. It had to be maintained deliberately, through structures that acknowledged human limits even as they demanded resilience. Rithka, reflecting on her journey from observer to participant, recognized that her species was undergoing a similar reckoning. Engagement carried costs, but so did withdrawal. The universe they inhabited was no longer one where cycles could be predicted solely by a star's behavior. It was shaped by the movement of countless lives, each carrying histories and needs that intersected unpredictably. To survive, they would have to adapt not just their technologies, but their philosophies. The region did not become peaceful. Skirmishes still occurred. Some groups rejected mediation outright. Losses continued. Yet the rate of catastrophic escalation slowed, nudged by the presence of nodes willing to engage, to share information, and to stand their ground when necessary. Kestrel Reach remained central to this effort, its existence a proof of concept more powerful than any proclamation. Humanity's role in this unfolding landscape was not that of savior or ruler. It was that of a species practiced in persistence, willing to absorb pressure and respond with adaptation rather than retreat. That practice, honed over millennia on an unforgiving world, translated imperfectly but effectively to the stars. It offered no guarantees, only the possibility of shaping outcomes through continued effort. As cycles turned and the mediation cadre settled into its work, the system's inhabitants adjusted their expectations. The future was not a horizon of inevitable collapse, nor one of assured stability. It was a terrain to be navigated, uneven and demanding. Humanity had planted itself on that terrain not because it was safe, but because leaving would not have been. In doing so, it had begun to exert a gravitational pull of its own, subtle but persistent, drawing others into patterns of interaction that favored continuity over destruction. The ground beneath Kestrel Reach remained scarred and reinforced, a physical manifestation of lessons learned. Beyond it, in the shifting dark, those lessons spread through action rather than declaration. Survival, the story suggested, was not about winning against the universe, but about refusing to let it dictate the terms without contest. Time did not heal the region so much as teach it how to carry its wounds. Cycles passed marked not by anniversaries or celebrations, but by updated models, revised protocols, and the steady accumulation of small choices that prevented larger disasters. The mediation cadre settled into an uneasy rhythm, responding to flare-ups along the corridor and beyond, sometimes successfully, sometimes arriving too late to do more than record loss. Each outcome fed back into the system, shaping expectations and refining methods. Kestrel Reach remained the quiet center of this activity, not because it commanded authority, but because it embodied continuity. Its structures grew denser and more layered, old sections reinforced rather than abandoned, new modules grafted onto existing frameworks with little regard for visual harmony. The settlement looked like what it was, a place that had been forced to adapt repeatedly without the luxury of starting over. To human eyes, it felt familiar. To others, it radiated a kind of stubborn credibility. Mara Kincaid's role gradually shifted again, away from immediate tactical oversight and towards stewardship. She spent more time mentoring successors, insisting that no system should rely too heavily on a single individual. Leadership, she believed, had to be transferable or it became a vulnerability. Her insistence frustrated some, comforted others, and ultimately strengthened the web of responsibility that sustained the settlement. When she finally stepped back from daily command, the transition was uneventful, which she considered a success. Jonah Reyes divided his time between the joint station and field missions with the mediation cadre. The work wore on him in ways that maintenance never had. Machines failed according to patterns. Societies failed according to stories people told themselves. He learned to listen for those stories beneath technical readouts, to flag moments when misunderstanding rather than malice drove escalation. He did not always succeed, but he grew better at recognizing when silence meant danger and when it meant hesitation. Rithka's perspective widened until she could no longer imagine returning to a purely observational role. The seventh planning cohort had changed as well, influenced by years of evidence that presence could alter outcomes without guaranteeing control. Hekaran policy evolved incrementally, codifying engagement where withdrawal had once been default. The shift was controversial, resisted by some who feared that abandoning old doctrines invited ruin. Rithka understood that fear intimately. Yet she also understood that doctrines untested by new conditions became liabilities. One moment crystallized this understanding more than any other. A large migratory group approached the region along a trajectory that would intersect multiple inhabited systems if left unaltered. Initial projections suggested inevitable conflict somewhere along its path. The mediation cadre established contact early, sharing data and proposing adjusted routes that would reduce pressure on vulnerable nodes. The response was divided. Some within the group accepted the information gratefully. Others rejected it, suspicious of manipulation. The situation teetered for days, communications strained by internal disagreement on the other side. Kestrel Reach and Hekara prepared defenses without broadcasting threat, a posture refined through hard lessons. The migratory group fractured under its own tension, a portion breaking away and altering course while the rest pressed on. Conflict erupted between the factions, brief but intense. When it ended, the altered course held. A chain reaction of avoided collisions followed, rippling outward in ways no single model could fully capture. The region did not notice the absence of disasters that never occurred. There were no monuments raised to paths diverted rather than destroyed. Yet within planning chambers and quiet observation rooms, the significance was understood. Influence exerted early, imperfectly, had reshaped trajectories on a scale that would have seemed impossible years earlier. It had not solved the underlying crisis. It had made it survivable. Life at Kestrel Reach continued in parallel, grounded, and immediate. Children grew into adolescents who remembered nothing but a world of shared vigilance. They learned to repair seals, to interpret alerts, to argue constructively in crowded forums. Their aspirations were pragmatic, shaped by an environment where contribution mattered more than abstraction. Some dreamed of leaving, of exploring systems beyond the corridor. Others imagined staying, improving what already existed. Both impulses were accepted as part of a healthy whole. Hekaran youth exchanges mirrored this development, their participants carrying back impressions of a species that treated danger as a constant rather than an anomaly. Over time, those impressions softened old prejudices. Humans were no longer categorized merely as volatile or reckless. They were seen as persistent, a quality distinct from aggression. The distinction mattered. Years passed without a system-wide catastrophe. Losses still occurred, sometimes sharply, sometimes quietly. The mediation cadre failed as often as it succeeded, yet the region did not unravel. Trade routes stabilized into semi-predictable patterns. Information sharing became normalized among a loose constellation of systems that had once acted in isolation. None of this resembled a grand order or unified front. It was a patchwork held together by habit and memory. Mara, older now, stood once more at an observation window, the restless sun casting familiar flares across reinforced glass. She felt no sense of completion, only continuity. The work had not ended. It never would, but it had changed shape. Humanity was no longer simply reacting to pressure. It was shaping the environment in which that pressure moved. Rithka joined her, her carapace catching the light at a different angle. They did not speak immediately. Silence, when chosen rather than imposed, had its own texture. When Rithka finally spoke, she did not frame her words as analysis or report. She spoke of perspective, of how her species had learned that survival under a violent sun required both retreat and resilience. She acknowledged that the universe now demanded a broader balance. Mara listened, nodding slowly. She did not respond with philosophy. She gestured instead toward the settlement below, to workers crossing gantries, to lights cycling as systems adjusted. This, her gesture said, was the answer humanity knew how to give. Not permanence, not dominance, but ongoing effort. Beyond the system, motion continued. Collapsing worlds still sent ripples of displacement outward. New conflicts flared where mediation failed or arrived too late. The region remained fragile. Yet within that fragility existed nodes of resistance to chaos, places where presence slowed collapse and bought time. Kestrel Reach was one such place, not because it was invincible, but because it refused to vanish quietly. Humanity did not reshape the galaxy through conquest or destiny. It did so by occupying space fully, accepting cost, and rebuilding when broken. That habit, exported imperfectly to the stars, altered the calculus of movement and conflict around it. Others learned to account for human ground not as empty or provisional, but as weight-bearing. The measure of unyielding ground was never found in declarations or borders. It was found in the decision to stay when leaving would be easier, to repair when abandoning would be rational, and to engage when indifference would be safer. Humanity carried that measure with it, wherever it settled, and in doing so, taught a crowded universe a new constraint. The stars remained vast and indifferent. But in their movement, they now bent, just slightly, around places where someone had decided that standing still was an act of defiance worth repeating.